Chapter 9. Delving into the 6 stages of the internal cycle with a focus on the U.S. Internal orders typically, though not always, change through a relatively standard sequence of stages, like how a disease progresses. By looking at their symptoms we can tell what stages they are in. For example, just as stage 3 cancer is different from stage 4 cancer in ways defined by different conditions that exist and have come about as a result of things that happened in prior stages, the same is true for the different stages of the big internal order or disorder cycle. Like diseases, different conditions warrant different actions to address them, and they produce a different range of probabilities that those actions will produce. For example, an old, unhealthy set of circumstances produces a range of possibilities and warrants different actions than a young, healthy set. As with cancer, it is best to stop the progress before getting into the later stages. Stage 1, when the new order begins and the new leadership consolidates power, which leads to. Stage 2, when the resource allocation systems and government bureaucracies are built and refined, which if done well leads to. Stage 3, when there is peace and prosperity, which leads to. Stage 4, when there are great excesses in spending and debt and the widening of wealth and political gaps, which leads to. Stage 5, when there are very bad financial conditions and intense conflict, which leads to. Stage 6, when there are civil wars or revolutions, which leads to. Stage 1, which leads to Stage 2, etc., with the whole cycle happening over again. These cycles have taken place for as long as there has been recorded civilization, and probably before, so many cycles are linked together like so, figuratively speaking, and they are upward sloping because of evolutionary gains that are made over time. Delving into the 6 stages of the cycle with a particular focus on the US now. Stage 5, when there are bad financial conditions and intense conflict. The classic toxic mix of forces that brings about big internal conflicts consists of 1. The country and the people in the country, or state or city, being in bad financial shape. For example, they have big debt and non-debt obligations like pension and healthcare obligations. 2. Large income, wealth, and values gaps within that entity. And 3. A severe negative economic shock. The single most reliable leading indicator of civil war or revolution is bankrupt government finances, often after an economic shock and when there are big wealth gaps. A classic marker of being in Stage 5 and a leading indicator of the loss of borrowing and spending power, which is one of the triggers for going into Stage 6, is that the government has large deficits that are creating more debt to be sold than buyers other than the government's own central bank are willing to buy, i.e., that leading indicator is turned on when governments that can't print money have to raise taxes and cut spending, or when those that can print money print a lot of it and buy a lot of government debt. As a rule, those places, cities, states, and countries that have the largest wealth gaps, the largest debts, and the worst declines in incomes are most likely to have the greatest conflicts. Facing these conditions, expenditures have to be cut or more money has to be raised in some way. The next question becomes who will pay to fix them, the haves or the have-nots. Obviously, it can't be the have-nots. But when the haves realize that they will be taxed to pay for debt service and to reduce the deficits, they typically leave, causing the hollowing out process previously described. History shows that raising taxes and cutting spending when there are large wealth gaps and bad economic conditions has, more than anything else, been a leading indicator of civil wars or revolutions of some type. Averages don't matter as much as the number of people who are suffering and their power. To have peace and prosperity, a society must have productivity that benefits most people. An essential ingredient for success is that the debt and money that is created is used to produce productivity gains and favorable return on investment rather than just being given away without yielding productivity and income gains, because if it is given away without yielding these gains, the money will be devalued to the point that it won't leave the government or anyone else with much buying power. History shows that lending and spending on items that produce broad-based productivity gains and return on investment that exceed the borrowing costs result in living standards rising with debts being paid off, so these are good policies. Decadence Bureaucracy. While early in the big cycle bureaucracy is low, it is high late in the cycle, which makes sensible and needed decision-making more difficult. Populism and Extremism. Populism is a political and social phenomenon that appeals to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are not being addressed by elites. It typically develops when there are 1. Wealth and opportunity gaps. 2. Perceived cultural threats from those with different values both inside and outside the country, and 3. Establishment elites in positions of power who are not working effectively for most people. Along with the rise of populists come more extreme positions on both sides and increased polarization. Right now there is an exceptional amount of polarization in the US as reflected in the stats. While who is president has changed, the people have not changed, and in the long run what happens in a democracy depends on what the people are like in dealing with the system. Watch populism and polarization as markers. The more populism and polarization there is, the further along the cycle a nation is in stage 5, and the closer it is to civil war and revolution. In stage 5, moderates become the minority. In stage 6, they cease to exist. Class warfare. In stage 5, class warfare intensifies. That is because, as a rule, during times of increased hardship and conflict there is an increased inclination a. To look at people in stereotypical ways as members of one or more classes and b. To look at these classes as either being evil enemies or good allies. A classic marker in stage 5 that increases in stage 6 is the demonization of those in other classes, which typically produces one or more scapegoat classes who are commonly believed to be the source of the problems, and if they are destroyed, imprisoned, or kept out, this will lead to better results. Minority ethnic, racial, rich, and poor groups are often demonized. Perhaps the most classic example of this is the demonizing and scapegoating of Jews, who were blamed and persecuted for virtually all of Germany's problems by the Nazis. Similarly, Chinese minorities living in non-Chinese countries have been demonized and scapegoated during periods of economic and social stress. In the UK, Catholics were demonized and scapegoated in numerous stressful periods since the 1500s, such as the Glorious Revolution and the English Civil War. The rich are also commonly demonized, especially those who are viewed to be making their money at the expense of the poor. Demonizing and scapegoating are a classic symptom and problem that we must keep an eye on. The loss of truth in the public domain. Not knowing what is true because of distortions in the media and propaganda increases as people become more polarized, emotional, and politically motivated. In stage 5, those who are fighting typically work with those in the media to manipulate people's emotions to gain support and to destroy the opposition. Even very capable and powerful people are now too afraid of the media to speak up about important matters or run for public office. Rule following fades and raw fighting begins. History has shown that when the causes that people are passionately behind are more important to them than the system for making decisions, the system is in jeopardy. Rules and laws work only when a. They are crystal clear and b. Most people value working within them enough that they are willing to compromise in order to make them work well. Late in stage 5 is when reason is abandoned in favor of passion. When winning becomes the only thing that matters, unethical fighting becomes progressively more forceful in self-reinforcing ways. When everyone has opinions that they are fighting for and no one can agree on anything, the system is on the brink of civil war or revolution. Late in stage 5, it is common for the legal and police systems to be used as political weapons by those who can control them. Also, private police systems form, for example, thugs who beat people up and take their assets, and bodyguards to protect people from these things happening to them. There are increasing numbers of protests that become increasingly violent. People dying in the fighting is the marker that almost certainly signifies the progression to the next and more violent civil war stage, which will continue until the winners and losers are clearly determined. That brings me to my next principle: when in doubt, get out. If you don't want to be in a civil war or a war, you should get out while the getting is good. What is the difference between a civil war and a revolution? A revolution is the process of bringing about revolutionary changes in how the system works. Civil wars, on the other hand, are violent fights for controlling wealth and political power or fights over ideologies that people feel are even more important than themselves. History shows us that revolutionary changes that take place within a system or order can be as large as those that come from civil wars. This period was also called the Gilded Age in the US, the Victorian era in the UK, and the Belle Époque in France because of the decadent spending that set in motion the revolutionary changes that started gradually and then accelerated to wipe out or redistribute virtually all wealth by 1950. In the 30 years from 1914 and 1944, there were 2 world wars and the global depression, which led to the creation of a lot of debt that had the interest rates on it legally capped while all major currencies were delinked from gold. Gold ownership was outlawed, the abilities to take money out of most countries were eliminated, and price controls on rent and other items were created. Then central banks printed a lot of money, which produced a lot of inflation, sharply reducing the real value of fixed income and equity assets. Additionally, in most countries, especially in Europe, businesses were expropriated or nationalized, and the war damage destroyed a lot of property. Capitalists and capitalism were widely blamed and hated especially as a result of the stock market crashes and depressions, so many of them were killed. Crossing the line from stage 5, when there are very bad financial conditions and intense internal and external conflict exists, to stage 6, when there is civil war, occurs when the system for resolving disagreements goes from working to not working. When one is in late stage 5, like the US is now, the biggest question is how much the system will bend before it breaks. History shows us that the biggest risk to democracies is that they produce such fragmented and antagonistic decision-making that they can be ineffective, which leads to bad results, which leads to revolutions led by populist autocrats who represent large segments of the population who want to have a strong, capable leader get control of the chaos and make the country work well for them. Different stages require different types of leaders to get the best results. When one is in stage 5, one is at a juncture in which one path could lead to civil war or revolution and the other could lead to peaceful, and ideally prosperous, coexistence. Obviously, the peaceful and prosperous path is the ideal path, but it is the much more difficult path to pull off. That path requires either a strong peacemaker who goes out of their way to bring the country together, including reaching out to the other side to involve them in the decision-making and reshaping the order in a way that most people agree is fair and works well, i.e., is highly productive in a way that benefits most people, or a strong revolutionary who is capable of taking the country through the hell of civil war or revolution. In our discussion of the next 2 stages about civil war or revolution and the times right after them, we will explore what is required. The US now. The United States is now in stage 5 and has not yet crossed the line into stage 6, the Civil War stage. When moderates are in the minority and extremists are in the majority in each party, there is a self-reinforcing pull to greater polarization and increased conflict. History has shown us that greater polarization equals either a greater risk of political gridlock, which reduces the chances of revolutionary changes that rectify the problems, or b some form of civil war. It would be unwise to be confident about whether the cycle will or will not progress to stage 6. However, because that would be a very big deal, it will be important to watch the markers closely. In my opinion, they will be best reflected in the 18 factors previously mentioned, though they can also be reflected by other markers. To reiterate, some of the most important markers I am looking at are the combination of financial circumstances, wealth gaps, and economic shock, classic toxic mix. Decadent spending of money and time. Bureaucracy. Populism and extremism. Polarization and loss of moderates. Class warfare and demonization of people in different classes. Polarized and distorted media. Rule following fading and power grabbing increasing. Legal and political systems increasingly used for personal political power. Fighting with fatalities. History shows us that when empires decline, they decline in most of these ways because when each of these types of strengths and weaknesses improve or decline, they reinforce the others. It also shows us that past a certain point, the factors deteriorate very rapidly together. What would good look like? It would be great to keep the peace and do the things necessary to have the 18 factors stop moving to the right, bad, part of the continuum, and to start moving to the left, good, part of the continuum. How should we judge whether policy makers are making the right moves to improve these things? Very simply, what governments do economically is reflected in just two types of policy: fiscal and monetary, and each can be either easy or tight. Easy means a lot of debt and money is created, which will lead it to become worth less if the country doesn't raise productivity by more than a commensurate amount, but it is stimulative for the economy and is an innocuous way of getting money into the hands of those who would not get it through the normal means. Tight means that a lot less debt and money is produced, so it will be devalued less, all else being equal, but it is less stimulative to the economy and gets less money into the hands of those who most desperately need it. So, we can watch how those trade-offs are handled. In addition to paying attention to the tight or easy fiscal and monetary trade-offs, which tell us the amount of borrowing and spending, we need to pay attention to what that borrowing and spending is used for. Most importantly, will it increase productivity and the well-being of most people, or will it not? History has shown that what matters most is what the system puts the credit and money into. We can watch that and judge whether or not it will raise productivity and real incomes for the whole and for most people. Of course, non-fiscal and non-monetary policies such as laws and regulations matter too, so they also should be assessed in terms of whether or not they will increase the country's strengths. The challenges of doing what is needed are that getting the necessary cooperation requires A. moderates to split from the extremists in their parties to try to pull the country together, which is very difficult to pull off, and B. big restructurings and revolutionary changes to be pushed through to yield revolutionary improvements, which is also very difficult to pull off. Stage 6. When there are civil wars. This section is about the part of the big cycle when there is a fight to get rid of the existing system or order, i.e., when there is a civil war. History shows us that civil wars inevitably happen, so rather than assuming that it won't happen here, which most people in most of the countries assume after an extensive period of not having them, one should be wary of them and look for the markers to indicate how close to one is. In this section we will look at those markers. Civil wars and revolutions inevitably take place to radically change the internal order, i.e., the system of distributing wealth and power. They include total restructurings of wealth and political power that include complete restructurings of debt and financial ownership and political decision-making. These changes are the natural consequence of needing to make big changes that can't be made within the existing system. Almost all systems encounter them. That is because almost all systems benefit some classes of people at the expense of other classes, which eventually becomes intolerable to the point that there is a fight to determine the path forward. When the gaps in wealth and values become very wide and economically bad conditions ensue so that the system is not working for a large percentage of the people will fight to change the system. Those who are economically suffering the most will fight to get more wealth and power against those who have wealth and power and who benefit from the existing system. Naturally, the revolutionaries want to radically change the system, so naturally they are willing to break the laws that those in power demand that they adhere to. These revolutionary changes typically happen violently through civil wars, though as previously described, they can come about peacefully without toppling the system. The periods of civil war are typically very brutal. How civil wars and revolutions transpire. While most of the archetypical civil wars and revolutions shifted power from the right to the left, many shifted wealth and power to the right and away from those on the left. Typically the people who lead the civil war or revolution were, and still are, well-educated people from middle-class backgrounds. They also typically were, and still are, charismatic and able to work well with others to build big, well-run organizations that have the power to bring about the revolutions that they led. If you want to look for the revolutionaries of the future, you might keep an eye on those who have these qualities. Over time they typically evolve from being idealistic intellectuals wanting to change the system to be fairer to brutal revolutionaries willing to win at all costs. While having large wealth gaps during economically difficult times was typically the biggest source of conflict, there were always also other reasons for conflict that added up to a lot of opposition to the leadership and the system. During the Civil War or Revolution stage of the cycle, the governments in power almost always had an acute shortage of money, credit, and buying power. That shortage created the desire to grab money from those who had it, which led those that had wealth to move them into places and assets that were safe, which led the governments to stop these movements by imposing capital controls, i.e., controls on movements to other jurisdictions, for example, other countries, to other currencies, or to assets that are more difficult to tax and or are less productive, for example, gold. To make matters even worse, typically when there was internal disorder, such as civil wars and revolutions, foreign enemies were more likely to challenge the country. Almost all civil wars have had some foreign powers participating in attempts to influence the outcome to their benefit. Entering and leaving civil wars and revolutions aren't clear when they are happening, though it is clear that one is happening when deeply in the middle of it. As for what types of leaders are best for civil wars and revolutions, they are the inspirational generals, people who are strong enough to marshal support and win the various types of battles they have to win. Because the fight is brutal, they have to be brutal enough to do whatever is necessary to win. While civil wars and revolutions are typically extremely painful, they often lead to restructurings that, if done well, can establish the foundation for improved future results. What the future after the civil war or revolutions looks like depends on how the next steps are handled. Let's take a peek. Stage 1, when the new order begins and the new leadership consolidates power. After the official civil war is over, there is typically post-civil war or revolution fighting to consolidate power. In this stage, new leaders typically mop up the remaining opposition and fight among themselves for power. In fact, one might say that revolutions typically come in two parts. The first part is the fight to bring down the established leaders and systems, and the second part is the fight to mop up those who were loyal to the former leaders and the fight for power among those who won. I will call the second part purges and touch on them in this section. During this stage, the leaders who do best are consolidators of power. Stage 2, when resource allocation systems and government bureaucracies are built and refined. A timeless and universal principle to keep in mind during this stage is that to be successful, the system has to produce prosperity for the middle class. The leaders who are best during this stage are typically very different from those who succeeded in stages 6 and 1. I call them civil engineers. While they need to be smart, and ideally they are still strong and inspirational, above all else they need to be great civil engineers or have great civil engineers working for them to design and build the system that is productive for most people. Stage 3, when there is peace and prosperity. This is the time for the inspirational visionary who can a. Imagine and convey an exciting picture of a future that never existed before, b. Actually build that future out, and then c. Use the prosperity earned to broaden the inclusiveness of it and to invest in the future. They do this while d. Maintaining sound finances and e. Producing excellent international relations, so that they protect or expand their empires without any financially or socially debilitating wars. Examples include: during this stage, the developments to pay attention to that reflect the big risks that naturally develop and undermine the self-sustaining good results are the widenings of the opportunity, income, wealth, and values gaps accompanied by bad and unfair conditions for the majority, luxurious and unfairly privileged positions for the elites, declining productivity, and bad finances in which excess debts are created. History shows us that the great empires and great dynasties that were able to sustain themselves stayed in stage 3 by avoiding these risks. Stage 4, a period of excesses. I also call this the bubble prosperity phase. There is the rapidly increasing debt-financed purchases of goods, services, and investment assets, so debt growth outpaces the capacity of future cash flows to service the debts. So, bubbles are created. These debt-financed purchases emerge because investors, business leaders, financial intermediaries, individuals, and policymakers tend to assume that the future will be like the past, so they bet heavily on the trends continuing. Conclusion. My study of history has taught me that nothing is forever other than evolution, and within evolution there are cycles that are like tides that come in and go out and that are hard to change or fight against. To handle these changes well, it is essential to know what part of the cycle one is in and to know timeless and universal principles for dealing with them. End of Chapter 9.